I'd like to show you the game between Peter Svidler and Magnus Carlsen from round 8 of the Biel Grandmaster tournament. And I think this game shows Carlsen's style very well, all the positives of his style, but also what can sometimes go wrong as well. So Svidler with white, 8-time Russian champion, actually has a plus score against Carlsen, 2-1 with many draws. They had a very exciting game in the first half of the tournament, where Svidler survived very well in a very complicated Najdorf. In this game, with black, Carlsen goes back to playing very steadily with the Berlin. You feel that he's had a lot of long games in this tournament, and he's wanted to just kind of calm things down a little bit. So he's going back to something very solid and something very familiar. Now, instead of the end game, d3 from Svidler. Bishop c5 is the normal move. So this can lead to quite tense positions if white wants to play, for example, with c3 and so on. But Svidler prefers to just calm things down and get a slight structural advantage. And, well, Carlsen has often played in this way with white. It's his kind of thing. Fixed structure, lots of manoeuvring. Bishop e6 has come into fashion over the last few years. And this gives black possible options to castle on the queen side, as we're going to see. Now, Carlsen here previously with white has played this, and this is a pretty standard setup with bishop b2. I should mention that, of course, knight takes e5 fails to queen d4, threatening f2 and threatening knight. Queen e2 from Svidler. Now, this has been played before, but somehow white's setup isn't very inspiring. Black has very easy development. The bishop stands, well, both bishops stand well on e6 and b6. Svidler, after 22 minutes, grabs the bishop, but yeah, he spent a long time here, and basically he said after the game that he wished he had a way to play for a win against the Berlin. He really wasn't satisfied with his opening. And it has to be said, after this, yes, of course, white can take that bishop, but actually black's pieces are very well placed, in particular the knight. Let me just give you a quick illustration of that. Game between Caruana and Nakamura, I think this was a rapid play or a blitz game online, went like this. And this basically shows the ideal setup for black, for the knight at any rate. That knight controls the key outposts on d4 and f4, and there's very little that can go wrong with black's position here, actually. It seems to me that black has equalized straight away. So this is white's problem. It's really difficult to get an advantage here, actually. And it's possible just to play f6 here, and I think black is absolutely fine after both sides castle, and the position looks about equal to me. But here we see Carlsen try to keep more juice in the position. He played queen e7, very interesting. He's always striving to get the most out of a position, to put pressure on his opponent, set questions, set problems for his opponent. So queen e7 looks perhaps to castle queenside. g3 from Svidler. Well, perhaps he's thinking later on of playing f4, but yeah, it's a slightly strange move. But then again, it also covers the f4 square when a knight will reach f4 as well. But yeah, it was clear that Svidler was not feeling particularly comfortable here because he'd invested a lot of time over his moves so far. as did Carlsen around here actually. He'd obviously, at this point, he put in a 20-minute think before he took on b3, and he was just making sure that he was comfortable with his middle game setup. And it was around this point he clearly decided to castle queenside. He can still castle kingside here, and I think the position is equal. This slight structural disadvantage on the queen side, whereby black lacks one centre pawn, it really isn't significant. That position is equal. But here is where Carlsen, whoops, I beg your pardon, this position, here's where Carlsen starts striving for more. He wants to put his king on the opposite wing to white's king, and that immediately creates an imbalance. So that's why he's played a6, so that the pawn isn't on prise when black castles, and that's a very solid clump of pawns, pawn constellation that really, it's very hard for white to bite against. That pawn advances on the queen side with either the b or c pawn don't really get anywhere at all. So this just sharpens the position. Even in an endgame where you have kings on opposite sides of the board, that can lead to some kind of race. But anyway, we have the middle game first. And here's an interesting moment, because you'd think perhaps it's time to get going on the king side. I'm sure Carlsen wanted to play like this. But in this case, the king isn't so well placed. Queen e3 I think is a nice move. And after king c7 to protect the pawn, then white advances in the middle of the board. And the king doesn't really want to be on c7 when the position opens. It's a little bit exposed. Another alternative for black would be to prevent white from playing d4. c5 does that, but it leaves d5 weakened, and I think white would maneuver the knight round via f5 or g2, and once the knight gets in there, well, that's not good. Carlsen instead, quite quickly, just tucked his king to the side, and that just shows the practical side of Carlsen. He probably didn't get involved in any kind of calculation in those other lines. He just realized, I need a safe king, and it's pointless analyzing other moves. First things first, put the king to safety and then see what happens. So if white were to play, for example, b4 here, then black can get going on the king side, g5, h5. It's not a winning attack, but it can be very useful to gain space anyway. Svidler broke in the center. I think if you start with c3 and rook d1, you should carry on. And it's logical to try and make something of this central pawn majority. Carlsen exchanged, and now sensible to recapture with the knight. If pawn takes, then the rook comes in the middle, and it's a little bit awkward having the knight there. It means you can't ever use the f-pawn to defend the e-pawn, and there's a chance to displace the knight with g5 and so on. So knight takes d4 is a logical move. Carlsen exchanged. Now pawn takes is possible, but Svidler wanted to simplify a little bit, which I understand. And here, if Carlsen exchanges, then it's hard for him to make progress against these pawns. You can switch between the e and the d pawn, but with rook d8, for example, but white's major pieces have everything under control here. I think it's about equal. But here's where Carlsen, again, in a seemingly quite dry position, finds a move that is just a bit disturbing for his opponent. He played h5. Obviously looking to advance again and open up the h-file, which just gives white one more thing to think about. Not only the center, but also what's going on the king side. It's always a big question, how do you deal with this rook's pawn advance? Do you block it? Do you ignore it? If h4, then black has the opportunity to open up the king side with g5, and this starts to get very sharp indeed. So I can understand why Svidler didn't want to go down that route. Notice in these situations how black's king is totally secure, while white's king starts to get a bit exposed. So for example, like this is probably white's best. And here, in fact, chances are still balanced, but in practical terms, you just don't want to have to handle your king when it's open. Just one more thing to think about. And what about h3, with the idea h4 and then g4? There are now two loose pawns, and black can take advantage of that straight away with queen e6. That's a neat idea. So Svidler decided just to ignore it. Rook d1. Now if all the rooks are traded, then black has, I think, very little chance of making anything. So Carlsen just exchanges one pair of rooks and then advances h4. And here Svidler just presses on with the d pawn. I was wondering if Svidler could just close things with g4. Carlsen, after the game, kind of curled his nose up at this a bit, and just clearly he just thought this is dangerous for white, because white's king has just been opened a little bit. But it's a very double-edged situation, of course. Well, that's what Carlsen wants, because if you reach an endgame, then white's king could wander up the board to g3. We're a long way from an endgame, but yeah, it's just interesting his reaction. g4 was what he wanted to see, basically, because it would keep the game alive. But Svidler played very practically and decided, right, I need counterplay, so let's push this pawn. Carlsen opened the h-file. Queen e5. Looking at the b2 pawn, and also looking to play queen h5 as well. It's necessary for white to play queen f3. Carlsen exchanged pawns, so Svidler has this big passed d pawn, but, well, there's lots going on in this position. This is a crunch moment, and actually Magnus was kicking himself after the game. He wasn't happy with what he did. He took the pawn on b2. And what I'm going to do is let me show you what happened in the game, and then I'll return to this position. After this, the d pawn advanced. Now it can't be prevented from going to d7. And Carlsen was pinning his hopes on putting the queen back on c6. Obviously a queen exchange would be very good for black because the king would come over. And with the queen on c6, there's enough pressure here, and sometimes you can even play the rook to h8 to slightly disturb white's king. So for example, queen d5, this is what black is looking for. And, well, it's going to be hard to make progress here, but it might be possible. a5, you might be able to create a passed pawn. There's also rook h8, which could threatening mate, which provokes f3, and then bring the rook back again, obviously. It's going to be very hard work to make something of this position, but it's the kind of situation that Carlsen really enjoys, where he can try and get something. You know, on a very good day, he might be able to switch the king to c7 to hassle this pawn. or put the king back on b8 and try to create a pass pawn here and get some kind of trade. Maybe a kingside pawn advance to just open up the king. Objectively, white is still fine, but there is a little bit of play, and that's what Magnus wanted. But coming back to this position, Svidler plays much better. Rook d6, he understood the situation extremely well. Rook d6 prevents the queen coming to c6. And after this, queen d1. So he's protected his wonderful pass pawn on d7 with queen and rook, but he's got the rook in front. And that means that it's very hard for black's queen to find a stable square. Here, the rook attacks the queen. And again, it attacks the queen. It keeps attacking the queen, and really, there's not a lot that black can do to make any progress here. And in this position, the players agreed to a draw. So, an intriguing fight, but let me bring you back to this situation. So instead of taking the pawn on b2, Carlsen could have played rook d8, preventing the d-pawn advancing just for a moment. Then, let's say queen d3. Now black has a choice. Black could just block that pawn and perhaps go for a kingside pawn advance, trying to open up the king, gain a little bit of space. That's one possibility. I think if anyone is better, it's black. I think it's still objectively even, but there's still chances there. Or you could go in for this queen takes b2. And in this case, the white's queen and rook are the wrong way round. And here you can see that black can get the queen to the best spot, c6. And yeah, maybe b5 with the idea b6 to shuffle the king across. Very hard to make progress, but it might be possible. Carlsen was clearly very annoyed after the game that he hadn't found this continuation. And I think coming back to the pros and cons of Magnus's style, so it was kind of amazing that he succeeded in generating any kind of winning chances in this position. But to do so, you have to keep playing so precisely. And just at this one moment, he made maybe a slightly inaccurate move. Not a blunder by any stretch, but he missed a chance to just keep the position alive. And yeah, it's very, very hard to keep playing so accurately all the time. And as I said, after game, he wasn't in the best of humour, gave fairly brief and to the point answers in our post-game interview. But yeah, he's a perfectionist. He wants to always give his best, so I kind of understand it. So that meant with 2 rounds to go after 8 rounds, Mamedyarov was still leading by a point in the tournament. And, well, Carlsen and Mamedyarov play in the 9th round, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens there.